This is The First Century, a podcast devoted to stories from that influential period of history including Rome, Judea, Christianity, and more. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Schmisek. Get ready to go back in time and enter a world before computers, the stagecoach, the printing press, or even stirrups had been invented for horses. We're about to enter the first century. Episode 9. The Death of Drusus, son of Tiberius. By the year 23, Sejanus had been raised to the rank of praetor, which was higher than one of his status as a knight could typically rise. This elevation further inflamed the ongoing enmity of Drusus, Tiberius' son, and several others. Sejanus certainly had enemies. Even so, he enjoyed overwhelming support, as statues of Sejanus were displayed in the Senate and in the theater of Pompey, which itself had been dedicated in 55 BCE. Though married to Agrippina and a father of 3 children with her, and having been made praetor, Sejanus' ambition was not quenched. He had been seducing Drusus' wife, Claudia Livia, a.k.a. Livilla. Their affair was a secret that had been going on for some time. Livilla had given birth to twins on October 10th, CE 19, the very same day her brother Germanicus had died in Syria. And as an aside, it's unclear even today whether Sejanus or Drusus was the father of these twins. Tiberius, as a proud grandfather to these twins, was so happy that he proclaimed to the Senate that twins had never been born to so distinguished a Roman father before. Drusus did not suspect anything about the children and their paternity, but still carried tremendous animosity towards Sejanus as a rival power. During one intense argument, Drusus actually struck Sejanus in the face, exclaiming, quote, "A stranger was invited to assist the government while the emperor's son was still alive." End quote. For Sejanus, this was becoming too much. He hatched a plan with Livilla to gradually poison her husband Drusus to death, at which point Sejanus would marry her, and then together they would take the throne. Even though she was married to the heir apparent, Livilla agreed with Sejanus' plan. So as a first step to better position himself to marry Livilla and move closer to securing the throne, Sejanus divorced Agrippina, the mother of his 3 children. Livilla then engaged her husband's cupbearer, the eunuch Ligdus, and her own physician, Eudemus, in the plot, and together they agreed to administer poison to Drusus. Drusus gradually became weaker and weaker, and each visit from the physician would not bring relief, but instead a further decline in his state of health. Eventually, Drusus died on September 13th, 23, at the age of 35. This death devastated Tiberius, but Sejanus' and Livilla's plot worked, as Tiberius suspected nothing, and handed even more of the day-to-day administration to Sejanus. Further, in gratitude for Sejanus taking on more responsibility, Tiberius commissioned additional statues of Sejanus to be placed throughout the city, even further elevating his role. After Drusus' death, Tiberius needed an heir. So he named Agrippina's oldest boys, Nero and Drusus, as heirs to succeed him. At the time, Nero was married to his cousin, Julia Livia. They had been married in about 23, but the marriage was not a happy one. But now that Nero and Drusus were named heirs, Agrippina and these 2 sons aroused Sejanus' suspicion. He shared his concern with Tiberius, and at this point, with Tiberius' son out of the picture, there were 2 poles of power, Sejanus on the one side, and Agrippina and her boys, Nero and Drusus, on the other. Sejanus considered this the right time to continue to implement his plan with Livilla, and so he requested from Tiberius permission to marry her. But Tiberius declined. Livilla was Tiberius' niece and daughter-in-law. If Sejanus was allowed to marry her, he would effectively become part of the imperial family, setting up yet another line of succession. So Sejanus and Livilla's plan was stopped for the time being, even if their clandestine affair continued. With Drusus' passing, Herod Agrippa lost his best friend. Tiberius was devastated at the loss of his son, and so he forbade any of Drusus' friends from seeing him because it caused such sorrow and only reminded him of his deceased Drusus. Shunned from the imperial court and the presence of Tiberius, the 34-year-old Herod Agrippa spent what remaining funds he had on trying to influence freedmen who had access to the emperor. But these efforts only succeeded in draining his already limited resources and left him in debt. He had not been back to Judea since he left at 6 years old, but circumstances now meant he had nowhere else to go. Herod Agrippa and his wife Cypros left Rome for Judea and settled for a time in their ancestral land of Idumea. Herod Antipas, having already successfully rebuilt Sepphoris, turned his attention in about 13 CE to founding the new city of Livius in Perea, named after Augustus's wife. The new city was founded on the site of a former Herodian palace, which had been burned to the ground by some Perean insurrectionists after Herod's death. Only about a year after work had begun on Livius did Augustus die, and Tiberius became emperor. So perhaps it's not a surprise that the third city that Antipas built was called Tiberius, named after the new emperor and the first city in that region to be founded within the framework of a polis. So, after Sepphoris and the Livius, he built the city of Tiberius about the year 23 on the western slope of the Sea of Galilee, which itself eventually became known as the Sea of Tiberias. Antipas made sure that the city of Tiberias had a stadium, as well as a large synagogue and a gold-roofed palace for himself. During the building of the city, workers discovered a cemetery. Not sure what to do, they asked Antipas, who ordered the cemetery destroyed. But of course this was in violation of Mosaic law. Potential inhabitants therefore considered the city unclean. So Antipas compelled Galileans and poor immigrants from abroad to move into the new city. He attracted others by exempting them from taxes for the first several years. Slaves were also liberated if they settled in Tiberias. In this way, the city of Tiberias grew and eventually became the capital of Galilee. The most powerful neighbor of Judea at that time was Nabatea, led by King Aretas, as we've heard about him in several episodes of this podcast thus far. The capital of Nabatea was Petra, Greek for rock, famed for its stone-carved buildings and the center of Nabatean trade routes. There was also a legend that the spring water which nourished the place was from the time of Moses. As we saw earlier, and as a reminder, Aretas had come to the throne about 9 BCE, during the time of Herod the Great. Aretas's relationships with Rome were cool in 9 BCE, but warmed up when the Roman general and governor of Syria, Varus, requested his assistance in putting down the Pentecost rebellion of 4 BCE. Because of this assistance, Augustus named Aretas king of Nabatea. Herod Antipas thus hoped to cement relations between his kingdom and the Nabateans, and so Herod Antipas married Aretas's daughter, Phasaelis. It was a perfect political marriage that would keep Antipas's tetrarchy at peace with the Nabateans, or at least it seemed like a good idea at the time. In about 24, a curious case of a nighttime fall and death captured the Roman imagination and the detective skills of Tiberius himself. Apronia, wife of Silvanus, a praetor of Rome, was found dead on the street outside the window of her upper-story apartment. Apronia's father was a good friend of Tiberius. In front of them both, Silvanus claimed that he was asleep and that his wife must have committed suicide, but neither Apronia's father nor Tiberius found his alibi persuasive. Tiberius immediately went to the scene of the crime and determined for himself that there was evidence of an altercation with a forced fall, what we might think of today as domestic violence. Tiberius turned the evidence over to the Senate, whereas Silvanus's own grandmother, Orgolania, a dear friend of Livia, sent Apronius a dagger with which to commit suicide. So he began leveling charges against Agrippina, her boys Nero and Drusus, and even their supporters. That same year, Tiberius and Agrippina's relationship had continued to be prickly, and the animosity between them only grew with time. Agrippina refused to eat at Tiberius's table for fear of being poisoned. Tiberius continued to deny Agrippina the right to remarry. The fact that she was requesting to marry implied that she needed a protector, a role, according to Augustus, that Tiberius was to fulfill. So Agrippina continued to foist herself into political matters. For example, her friend and second cousin, Claudia Pulchra, widow and third wife of Varus, the general of the disastrous Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, was accused of adultery, intrigue, and witchcraft. Agrippina believed that Claudia Pulchra was only being charged because they were friends. It was a way of harming Agrippina herself and sending a not-so-veiled message. Agrippina stormed into Tiberius's quarters to confront him, only to find him making a sacrifice to Augustus. She said, "What good is a sacrifice to Augustus when you're persecuting Augustus's blood relatives?" She continued, "The blood of Augustus is not in any idol, but flows through the veins incarnate in the one before you." Tiberius turned and replied to her in Greek with a maxim, "Just because you're not queen, my little girl, do you think you've been wronged?" Claudia Pulchra was condemned, and the animosity between Tiberius and Agrippina would only continue to grow. Quarrels with Tiberius continued, and now even from his mother. Livia claimed to be Tiberius's equal. After all, she'd been given the honorific title Augusta, but Tiberius wouldn't have it. She asked her son Tiberius to do certain tasks, some of which required Senate approval, and he replied that he would only submit these if they came with a note saying that the princeps was being forced to do this by his mother. At that, Livia became enraged. She went to a special chest and took out letters that she had kept there for years. These letters had been written to her by Augustus, in which Augustus talked about Tiberius's austerity and stubbornness. Livia lit into her son. Tiberius asked why his mother had even kept these letters for so long, only to bring them out now with such a spiteful spirit. He determined then and there to leave the city and go to Capri. As it turned out, he would never see her again. His action of withdrawing from the city were in many ways reminiscent of how he handled the situation with his wife Julia years ago. Only this time, Tiberius himself was princeps. Even so, rather than go to Rhodes as he had done years ago, he retired to an imperial villa that had once belonged to Augustus. It was from there that he would oversee the affairs of the empire, leaving day-to-day matters to Sejanus. Tiberius had always been weary of choosing legates and governors for the provinces. He would not choose men based on their virtue, as he did not want virtuous men overshadowing himself. But he also would not choose men of vice, as they were likely to cause trouble. So as a middle way, he chose those of mediocre qualities, who would do what he wanted. As a result, many of the governors were less competent than those that Augustus had appointed, and quite often he would appoint someone and not send them to the province at all. Now that Tiberius had abandoned Rome for Capri, Sejanus, in the name of the princeps, sent a knight by the name of Pontius Pilate to be prefect of Judea, reporting to the governor of Syria. However, at the time the legate governor of Syria was Lucius Aelius Lamia, who had earlier been governor of Pannonia and Germania, so Syria was a good appointment for him. The problem was, he had been appointed about 4 years earlier and was never allowed to leave Rome. Pilate would become prefect of Judea, while the governor of Syria remained in Rome. Next time, we'll learn more about Pontius Pilate and what happened when he arrived in Judea as prefect.